Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and we're up to episode 27 in our series on the Ruy Lopez. In this episode, we're going to take a look at various anti-martial variations that white can try to avoid the martial gambit, of course. So here we go. There's the Ruy, we're in the Morphy system, closed Ruy, and now, of course, if black is not interested in the martial, he'll generally play d6, and after c3 castles, h3 occurs. And this is kind of the basic starting position of the mainline closed Ruy. From here, black has all kinds of possibilities, of which the main three are knight a5, knight to b8, and bishop to b7. We'll discuss all of those in subsequent videos. But for now, we look at black castling kingside. And this is a useful move in a way, because it may encourage white to play something to avoid the martial gambit that is perhaps not as enterprising. What I mean is this. Okay, if white plays c3, black can of course play the martial with d5, but he can also play d6, and then just transpose into regular Ruy Lopez's. But if you think that the anti-martial setups for white aren't very good, then even if you have no intention of playing the martial at all, it might be worth using this move order just to see how white responds. All right, so from here, white has got, I think, four main anti-systems. So there's a4, which is the classic main anti-martial variation, and it still has quite a bit going for it, I think. There's slow playing with d3, and this is a kind of approach we'll look at in a later video, I think. Then there's d4, which is, in fact, really quite a lot of fun, and leads to some very exciting positions. And then finally, there's h3, which has been the main anti-martial for some years now. All right, well, let's look at these in the following order. So we'll start with d3, just because all I'm going to say is stay tuned for another video. We've discussed d3 a little bit in the context of meeting the Archangelsk in this way, and I think we looked at very early d3 variations. White is not saying that he'll never play d4, but he's going to wait and see what black does. Either play a3, c3, sometimes knight c3, and depending on what kind of system black chooses, will determine whether he's going to open the center or not. And there are advantages to keeping the center closed as well. So this is an important kind of approach in general in the closed Ruy, not just limited to its value in an anti-martial context. All right, let's discuss a4. So this is, again, the classic anti-martial approach. All right, against this, black has three ways, or at least three standard ways of dealing with the threat of a takes b5. Either play rook to b8, play bishop to b7, or play b4. Let's look at each of these. So first of all, rook to b8, I don't have too much to say about, primarily because it's not chosen that often, and it's really just illogical, and in fact, it hasn't done very well. White just gets the A file for free. Black gets nothing in return for it. And now white can play any normal Ruy Lopez move he wants. C3, D3, H3, knight C3. Probably any of those will give white a small advantage. So rook to b8 is really just giving white something for nothing. Okay, bishop to b7 I think is the most common choice in the database, although not for a while. I think its day in the sun is long past, and it's not even close to the main move at the top level. The reason why is one that you'll probably know and be able to state for yourself if you watched the videos on the Archangelsk variations, and it's that white can just play d3, again, making the bishop on b7 bite on granite. In fact, I think this transposes to positions that we saw back when we were covering the Archangelsk, and I don't have anything special to add to that. I think white has good chances for an edge here. So the real move here is b4, grabbing space, preventing white from playing knight to c3, and then to d5 from there, and not giving up the a file. So white has really two main ways to proceed from here. It can play a5, trying to fix the pawn on a6 as a slight weakness, and artificially isolate the b pawn for that matter, while the alternative is to play, I'm sorry, not check, first d3, d6, yeah, and now either a5, which fixes the pawn on a6, and also stops black from playing knight to a5, or alternatively, there's knight b to d2. So just getting on with development and trying things out from there. All right, well, let's have a look at a5, first of all. So the one thing to note is that while it kind of isolates the a6 pawn, it kind of separates it from the herd, so to speak, it also separates white's a pawn from the rest of the pawn structure. And it too can be weak. I mean, black might play rook b8, rook b5 at some moment. So that's going to be a battle. White gets the c4 square, maybe the a4 square for his bishop, and both sides have potential pawn weaknesses. One standard plan for black here is to play bishop b6, queen c8, and then rook b8, b5, as I mentioned. All right, so from here, bishop b6, knight b to d2, queen c8, and here, usually knight to c4 is played, but bishop to c4 has been played as well, and on rook to b8, b3. So here, black is, of course, not going to be able to play rook to b5, and therefore white's a5 pawn is safe. Nevertheless, with knight to d7 followed by bishop to f6 and knight to c5, it seems that black is doing just fine here. So an alternative approach for white is knight to c4. Black plays rook to b8. And here, I think the usual move is h3, but I'll mention bishop to g5, which was chosen by Peter Lecko in a couple of games. One idea of this is to go for a kind of a typical anti-d5 plan. Not that white is trying to stop black from playing d5, but that white wants to occupy d5. So ideas like bishop takes f6 followed by knight to e3, and then dropping a minor piece on d5. That's one idea of this, but it's not all that compelling. And in a couple of games that Lecko played, one against Anand, one against Aronian, they both played king to h8 with the idea of knight to g8 followed by f5, and in both cases black won. Of course, anyone can lose to Anand and Aronian, but nevertheless, this seems to indicate at least that the plan is not too terrifying from black's point of view. So instead, h3 is more usual. Okay, h6, bishop e3, rook d8. White plays queen to e2, getting out of the way of any d5 ideas that might leave the rook on d8 and the queen on d1 in a bad tactical opposition from white's standpoint. So bishop to f8, typical idea, in part to play g6, bishop g7, and so on, but also clearing the e-file for a rook in case the one side or the other of the e-file opens up. Okay, knight f to d2, preparing bishop to a4, and then in case the knight moves away, maybe to play d4. So the knight on d2 backs up the knight on c4, and it also protects the e4 pawn so that d4 won't hang it. All right, knight e7, d4, knight g6, d5, bishop d7. Here, c3 would be a mistake because of takes, and then knight e4, taking advantage of the overloaded white knight on d2. It's got to protect the bishop on b3 as well. So first, bishop to a4, but now bishop to b5. So just in time here, and white has a difficult time making progress. b3, bishop b7, rook e to c1, c6, takes, knight b6, queen b7, takes, queen c4, and a draw was agreed in the game Adams-Anand from the World Championship in San Luis in 2005. In fact, black might even have some small chances for an edge with queen to b7 followed by d5. So black is in fine shape here. So going back, instead of a5, the alternative is to play knight b to d2 and just get on with the regular kingside and development plans. All right, from here, if black plays bishop to e6, now white's happy just to trade, play knight f1 and knight to g3. And white has scored pretty well here. So more usual is knight to a5 and then c5, kind of a Chigorin-style approach, expanding on the queen side. White plays c3, rook to b8. Knight c6 has been tried, but d4 looks pretty good for white. This was Anand against Grishuk from the World Championship in Mexico City in 2007. And this illustrates what I had said before, namely that white will often play d4 anyway, even after playing d3. So it's a matter of timing. It's not a renunciation. All right, so rook to b8 instead of knight to c6. d4, queen c7, takes, And you can see that black is really trying to find some way to just shut down the queenside with either b3 or c4. If you can't do that, then white's light square bishop is going to be very strong, and c4 and d5 are both vulnerable points from black's point of view. So knight to c4, and if, for instance, black were to trade, then white would have just a really beautiful position, and might then play bishop g5, try to take the knight, and then play knight d2, f1, e3, and dominate on the light squares in the center. So black is more or less committed, due to his positional weaknesses here, to do something a bit sharp. Rook to d8, queen e2, and now b3. Well, if the bishop goes back to b1, then that bishop, and accordingly the rook on a1 for that matter, will have a terrible time getting into the game. So white trades and plays bishop to b1. Now, the bishop's ready to come to d3, and once it goes to d3, then again it goes to c4, and white takes over in the center. So c4, and then white plays queen takes c4, and from here, black's goal is to do whatever he can to not let that bishop from b1 get back into play. So it's an interesting gambit. It's not clear that black has enough for the pawn, but it's like I said, it's an interesting idea. Tomaszewski played this against Caruana in a recent tournament earlier this year in 2012, and that game ended up actually a pretty easy win for Caruana. At least it was easy in terms of the ideas. So, but the thing about that game is that Tomaszewski, I think, just seemed to have forgotten the way to play. So check that game out, but don't stop with that game. Look at the earlier games in the variation too, and it'll give you some idea as to what black's options are. All right, so that's all I wanted to say about a4. So it's not a bad option, and clearly, I mean, if Caruana is playing it even in 2012, it's still got some life in it. All right, we discussed d3. Now let's talk about a line that's very different, and that's d4. Although we have to break this down into two directions. So one direction is d6, and then after c3, bishop to g4 just takes us to the Yates variation, which will have to be the subject for another video. Or, of course, black could play something else. I mean, maybe allow white to transpose to a Chigorin with h3 next, but bishop to g4 is normal. Okay, another option that's minor is e takes d4. Now, of course, white doesn't play knight takes d4 because that's a Noah's Ark trap. Black just takes the knight, plays c5, plays c4, and white loses the bishop on b3. So you've always got to be aware of that little trick. It's very simple, it's elementary, but until you've fallen for it once, chances are you might fall for it at some point in your life. So in this kind of position, you can't do it. Takes, takes, queen takes, c5, and then c4, and goodbye, bishop on b3. So here, white plays either, white always plays e5, and then after knight to e8, now white plays either bishop to d5, getting the bishop outside of the cage, or the potential cage, or white can play a gambit with c3, and we'll see another version of this gambit coming up. Okay, so those are two lines that are a little bit beside the point for what we're really going to focus on now, and that's knight takes d4. Well, again, knight takes d4 is of course impossible. We've already discussed that. But white has two very decent options. One is to take on d4, but of course, e5, knight e8, and actually queen takes d4 can be played here because if c5, there's queen to e4, so you're hitting the rook. Although here too, black is doing fine after rook to b8. Also, black can play bishop to b7, c4, c5, queen g4, d6, and this should be okay for black as well. White has some small attacking prospects on the king side, but black has his trumps too, in particular the potentially very, very powerful and expansive queenside pawn structure, pawn majority over there. So queen d4 is really not the big idea. The big idea here after knight takes d4, e5 and knight e8 is to play c3. All right, so black should grab the pawn. Knight takes, d6, queen f3 hitting the rook, bishop e6, and now knight to d5. All right, from here, black has two main options. He can either trade the knight on d5, giving up the bishop pair, but that knight's very good too, so it's not clearly a bargain to keep it on the board. or he can move the rook away, since white is threatening to play knight takes e7 check, and then queen a8. So let's look at each quickly. Bishop takes, rook to b8. And now white has three moves that are all pretty decent. e6 is interesting. Rook to d1 hasn't been tried before, but it looks like a pretty good move. It seems that white should have some edge here. Of course, d takes e5 is no good, because bishop f7 check, rook f7, rook takes d8, rook takes f3, and then either rook takes b8, which is clearly best, or even rook takes e8 check, and then g takes f3, and white is winning at least a piece. The third option is to play bishop to e3, and this threatens bishop a7, rook c8, and then bishop to b7, snaring an exchange. So in all of these positions here, after bishop takes d5, white seems to enjoy some edge. So the alternative is rook to c8. Bishop f4, d takes e5, takes, and then knight to d6. And Aronian has had this position with black twice, once against Peter Lecco in the Yermuk Grand Prix in 2009, and once against Mickey Adams in Vaikonze in 2008. And both games I believe he drew, and the position probably is about equal here. So white has full compensation for the pawn, but probably not more than that. All right, so that is after knight takes d4. Well, so back to here. So that was d4, knight d4, knight d4, ed4, e5, knight e8, c3. But going back to this position here, there's a second rather startling option that white has, and that's bishop takes f7 check. All right, rook takes f7, knight e5, and here black has nothing better than to retreat the rook. If he plays knight to e6, then takes, e5, and there's a big oops coming up for black, to wit, knight e8, queen f3 check, and the old rook in the corner pocket is falling out. I guess that metaphor doesn't work once you have to see what happens to the rook. So something goes into the corner pocket and pool. Here it's something dropping out of it. Or you could say the queen goes to the corner pocket. Anyway, knight e6 is not a good move here. I guess maybe knight to c6 might be playable. Doesn't look much better, but it at least avoids that tactic. Anyway, black basically always plays rook to f8 here. And now queen takes d4. So white's up a pawn, and you might think, well, this is just terrific. I mean, white's got a nice presence in the center, and you know, it's hard to see, at least at first sight, what black's got going by way of counterplay. But in fact, black has decent chances here. So there are two main moves here. Bishop to b7, I think, is probably the absolute main move, but c5 is also quite standard and important. All right, white has tried queen to d3, queen to c3, and queen to d1. I think queen to d1 is both the most popular and the best try for an advantage. There's probably a relationship between those two facts. And here, after bishop to b7, threatening the pawn, knight to c3, queen c7, threatening the knight g4. Yeah, you don't want to play knight f3 if you're white here, because after knight to g4, then you've got to start worrying about these tricks with rook f3. So knight to g4 is at least, even if knight f3 is somehow playable, this looks much simpler. So knight to g4, takes, bishop d6, g3, rook a to e8, and black is not in terrible shape by any means. I mean, it's close to equal, but maybe white has a very slight pull. So, but this is certainly playable for black, no question about it. Nevertheless, I would say that bishop to b7 is the main line, and Peter Lecco has tried this and I think makes a pretty decent case for it. So here's an example of his characteristically very deep preparation, leading also very characteristically to a draw. So c4, typical idea, c5, queen d3. One reason for c4 is that it prevents black from continuing his expansion with c4 himself and then putting the bishop or the queen, or maybe both someday, on the a7, g1 diagonal. All right, queen c7, hitting the knight. And of course, bishop f4, knight h5 is bad, so knight f3. B takes c4, queen c4 check, d5, takes. And again, all very forcing play. Okay, queen e2 covers the knight, hits the bishop on e7, so bishop to d6. And now black threatens to take on f3 and h2. And it seems like white really has nothing better probably than to just allow it, to kind of force him into it. I guess he could play h3, but rook a to e8 is coming. Maybe knight h. Well, no, not knight h5, but definitely rook a to e8 is a nuisance move. So his opponent Gadakamsky again played in Yermak in 2009. Chose knight to c3. So then takes, king over, rook a to d8, and black's got some pawn weaknesses on the queen side, but he's very active. He's ahead in development. White's king is slightly misplaced, and all in all, this is enough for black to hold the balance. And we'll see, by the way, there's a good reason why the rook is on d8. So the game continued g3, hoping to pull a Spassky-Fischer on that bishop on h2. But now a very nice drawing combination. Knight h5, hitting the queen with the rook on f8, and if the queen moves, then of course white is going to get creamed by black taking with something on g3. So queen h5 is forced, and now rook takes f2 check. King f2, queen g3 check, king e2, queen g2 check, and now we see what the rook is doing on d8. It's preventing the white king from escaping. So king e3 is forced, queen g3 check, and there's nothing white can do. If he plays king to e4, then rook to d4 is mate. If he plays queen f3, then if nothing else, rook to e8 check will win the queen. Maybe there's even better. Maybe bishop to g1 check first. No. Let me think. No. If queen f3, oh, sorry, rook to d3 check. Yeah, not rook e8 because of knight e4, but just rook to d3. And so that leaves only king to e2. And now it doesn't seem as if there's any way for black to make a decisive attack. So there are various perpetuals, and he just chose this one, and the game was agreed drawn at this point. All right, so you can see then that after d4, there's a lot of adventure to be had after knight d4, bishop f7, rook f7, knight e5, and queen d4. But I think bishop to b7, as played in this Kamsky-Leko game, seems to be good enough for equality. Black's bishops get very active. The f-file is useful. And all in all, with white's slightly lagging development on the queen side, black seems to be okay. Okay, so now we've discussed a4, d3, and d4, and that leaves just the main move, h3, or the contemporary main move with h3. So here, black can choose between several options. He could play d6, and then after c3, we're back to the regular main starting position of the closed Ruy-Lopez. He could play, well, he could but should not play d5. So here, this is actually not a very good kind of quasi-martial gambit. So takes. And the problem for black is that white hasn't played c3. So there's no possible hole on d4 on d3. Excuse me. White doesn't have to spend another tempo playing d4. You can also bring the knight to c3 in some cases. So it may be playable, but black definitely hasn't done very well here, and it's certainly an inferior version of the martial gambit for black to play in this way. All right, so the main move here is bishop to b7. And now after d3, so once again, we've discussed this idea many times. We have a last major junction point in our discussion. So there's d6, so we can again kind of go the slow way. And here, white can play c3, but white can also play a3. And so this, I could kind of postpone this one as well and say, well, once again, c, d3 variations later on. But I will say a little bit about this in a moment. But first, I'm going to discuss the gambit line with with d5. Oh, one other possibility too is rook e8. Against this, white plays knight c3, and I think is doing well. All right, so d5. So this is a very, very popular line. Black insists on sacrificing a pawn, but it's got kind of a different feel to it than the typical martial gambit. Etienne Bacrot, I would say, has been the main advocate of this variation. At least he was in the late 2000s, mid to late 2000s. Nowadays, this variation certainly hasn't disappeared, but it's becoming a little bit less popular. All right, so from here, e takes d5, knight takes d5, and now white can either say no thank you to the gambit or accept it. Pretty much the same thing you can do with almost any gambit. Well, let's start with declining it. So if you're like me and think that the best way to survive a gambit is to decline it, or maybe to accept it and then return it, you might like knight to c3. Now, I'm exaggerating a bit. I mean, there's some gambits that you should just take and hold on to it, but very often it's a much easier way to live to reject gambits or again to accept and then return them. All right, I don't know if it's best in this case, though. I think black should equalize against knight c3, but it's not bad. Takes and takes. Now, from here, you might want to give yourself a little exercise and try to determine what black to move should do. I think I've improved on the theory of this variation, maybe for both sides. All right, well, first of all, I'll mention what black certainly should not do, and that's bishop to d6. So this was played against me in a recent blitz game, and this is just maybe an outright, if not quite a question mark move, it's definitely very, very, very dubious. So I played knight to g5, threatening to win immediately with queen to h5, hitting f7 and h7. So he played h6, I played knight e4, and next I'm just going to play queen h5, and he kind of walked into it here with king to h8. I played queen to h5, and he realized that this is not going to be the path to happiness, but with king to g8, I mean, giving up too tempting a position like this is just catastrophic. And I've got many good moves here. Rook to e3 is certainly quite good, but the obvious bishop takes h6 is just a trivial win. He took, I checked, no reason to play queen h6. I don't have to. I can get there with tempo. And of course, knight f6 is completely crushing, but rook e3 is crushing-er, so to speak, and there's really nothing he can do about the mate. Even if he plays knight to e7, it doesn't stop it because rook g3, knight g6, rook takes g6. Takes advantage of the pin. So he resigned here. All right, so bishop to d6, that was just very light entertainment. Much better, of course, is to play bishop f6 or queen to d6, both of which are known. But I think in both cases, white maybe has a little pull. So here, for instance, bishop to a3, which hasn't been played, although it's been played in similar positions. I think this maybe gives white a little edge. Rook e8, knight to d2, followed by knight to e4, and I would prefer white very slightly here. Another move that's been played is queen to d6. Against this, a4, knight a5. Now, maybe bishop to a3 is okay. That was played once, but the more patient bishop to a2, maybe even a little bit better. Waiting to see how black reacts to the threat of knight takes e5. Note, by the way, that bishop to a3 is still a possibility because after queen takes a3, white will have bishop takes f7 check, and then rook takes a3, at least in many positions. I mean, you have to count up all the goodies that black gets there, but it's certainly a possible option. All right, so if I keep saying that white is probably slightly better, then why doesn't white always play like this? Well, one idea I have for black is rook to e8, and at least as of this point, as of this recording, the move has not been played, but it seems to me to be pretty good. Black just insists on this gambit and kind of waits to see what white is going to do. Knight to g5 isn't possible here. Bishop to a3 is not possible here. Knight to d2 looks a little bit bizarre at this point without the bishop having committed to f6 or d6. So what should white do? Well, one idea might be a4. Another idea is to just grab the pawn. But then takes, bishop f6, takes. And although bishop to d2 protects the c3 pawn for the moment, black has queen to c6. And he would also have that against d4 instead, too. And this regains the material because the threat is queen takes g2 checkmate. And against any normal response to that threat, there's bishop takes c3 next. So I think black is equal, for instance, in this position. So after this line, so again, h3, bishop to b7, d3, d5, takes, knight c3, I think, does not lead to an edge after this. So let's look at capturing. Knight e5, and here there's a choice between the older knight to d4 and the choice of the 2012 generation, which is knight takes e5. So knight to d4 is the main move. There are lots of games on this, lots of theory, and there's no universally dominant white reply. White has tried knight to c3. That's the most common move overall, but white doesn't have a very good score with it. Bishop to d2 looks kind of clumsy, but in fact, white has done reasonably well with that. And there's also knight to d2, which has also scored reasonably well. And that's what my focus will be here. So knight to d2, c5. Here, knight d to f3 is possible too, but we'll stick to just c3 instead of this. So now takes, queen c7, and a4. And I would say that black is probably okay here, but there was a recent game, Gashimov against Tomaszewski from the World Cup in 2011, where white did go on to win. So this is kind of a characteristic sort of position. Black has some compensation. I mean, he's got a little lead in development. He's got the bishop here, a little extra space in the center. But, you know, it is a pawn. And in the absence of some clear targets, it may prove difficult for black to prove full compensation. So I think because of positions like that, attention is shifted over now to knight takes e5. So rook e5, queen d6, rook e1, rook a to e8, knight to d2, preparing to bring the knight to e4 or f3 as need may arise, and now c5. Well, what to say about this position? Well, I'm not going to say too much about it, but I will say a little bit, and two things in particular. So the first thing is that my computer, and I'm guessing yours too, will claim that white is slightly better here. And maybe white is slightly better. I don't know. But in 6 Grandmaster games as this year, as of mid-July 2012, black has scored 3 wins, 3 draws, and no losses. So I don't know. Maybe black is in fact doing quite well here. So it's hard to say whether it's you know, just how random things go, and it just seems kind of unusual, but it doesn't really have any meaning, or if there is some good way for white to proceed, but he's missed it in games beforehand, or if it's just a position that's very difficult for white to play, even if it's theoretically good, or what. So I don't know. I'm just warning you that despite what your engine may say, at least in practice, in Grandmaster practice, things have gone very well for black from this point. So, you know, caveat lector. Okay, so now finally back to the d6 line. So from here, as I said, c3 is possible too, but we'll look at a3, keeping the bishop on its favorite diagonal, on the traditional Spanish diagonal. Well, from here, black has at least 4 different plans. He can go Chigorin with knight to a5 and c5. He could take a Breyer-style approach with knight to b8 and then knight to d7. He could take a Zaitsev approach with rook e8, bishop f8, and so on. And then also, you could go for a kind of Karpov variation approach with queen d7 and knight to d8, generally to be followed by knight e6. And from there, the knight might go to c5 or someplace else. And it also shuts off the long diagonal from a2 to g8. All right, well, we'll look at 2 of the approaches. We'll look at the Chigorin-style knight a5 and the Breyer-style knight to b8. So first, knight to a5. Okay, bishop a2, c5. Here, white has a choice. He can put the knight on c3, which is one of the advantages of not playing c3. And the knight c3 idea, or the knight c3 move can go in 2 different directions. One is with, again, this classic plan of trying to occupy d5, where you play bishop g5, take on f6, and then plunk the knight on d5, or maybe the bishop on d5, try to trade that off as well, and then be left with a knight on that square. Alternatively, the knight from c3 can go to e2 to g3 to f5. So you don't have to get to f5 by going to d2 to f1 to e3 or g3. And then f5, you can get there in by other means too. In fact, you could go knight c3, d5, e3, f5. So lots of different, lots of routes. All right, so I mentioned that possibility, but I'll instead give a variation on knight b to d2, the other main approach. So knight c6, knight f1, bishop c8. Yeah, and there's nothing really for the bishop to do on b7, certainly not while white has a pawn sitting on d3. So that's certainly been a running theme here in our shows on the Ruy Lopez. All right, at this juncture, white now plays c3, preparing sometimes to play b4, in fact, but also d4. So both moves become possible, and it also prevents black from playing knight to d4 himself, which might be an interesting simplifying option in some cases. All right, black plays bishop to e6, neutralizing the strong Spanish bishop. And now white can trade and play b4. And in fact, white has scored pretty well here and may, in fact, be slightly better. So black has to be careful about quite a few things. I mean, there are positions where white can play queen b3 and knight to g5. Additionally, black is really kind of restrained, well, almost across the board, really, with black no longer having an f-pawn. There aren't any ideas of him playing for kingside expansion by moving the knight from f6 and playing f5. It's tough for him to play d5 because then the e5 pawn will be very weak. And because of, again, the white pawn triangle on a3, b4, and c3, it's pretty difficult for black to push pawns on the queen side as well. So it's not that white has anything huge at the moment, but black is, again, very constrained here, and white can kind of pick and choose plans at his leisure. So white has scored pretty well here. All right, so instead of the Chigurh plan, you might consider instead the Breyer plan. All right, now after knight to b8, knight b to d2, knight d7, knight f1, rook e8. Here, white could play knight to g3, but knight to e3 looks more natural. You know, the one advantage, of course, of knight to g3 is that you leave the bishop from c1, you leave its diagonal open. So that's the one drawback. The plus of the knight on e3, though, is that in addition to f5, it also hits d5, and sometimes the knight can go to g4. That's also sometimes a pretty good square for the knight. And if black takes, then the pawn on g4 can be very good. It might even go to g5 at some point. So the pawn on g4 actually has two possible roles. Sometimes it can support a knight going to f5 even as a piece sacrifice. Other times it goes to g5 and really constricts the black king side. So you can find, I think, if you do a position search for that kind of structure in Ruy Lopez's, you'll find some useful examples in the database. Anyway, so after knight e3, if black plays knight to c5, then bishop a2 is simple and probably slightly better for white. So alternatively, there's h6. And this, what we're going to follow now through the end, is a game between Anand and Aronian from a rapid tournament. I think it was the Botnick Memorial in Moscow in 2011. Now, those of you who follow Top Chess will know that Aronian has basically been Anand's most difficult opponent for some years now. I mean, Anand's score against Aronian is just absolutely terrible. But he wins this game, so maybe that means that white's position is even better than you might think, at least given Anand's usual results against his opponent. So anyway, from here, Anand plays bishop to a2, taking the bishop out of the knight's reach from c5, and maybe in some cases preparing b4. But really, it's just kind of a useful waiting move, waiting to see what black does while putting the bishop where it's safe. So bishop f8, knight h2, preparing to put a knight on g4 without taking back with a pawn. Knight c5, knight h to g4, takes. And white is slightly better here. I would say from this point here, white has an edge. Or we can safely say that white has an edge. Okay, knight e6. So black would like to trade queens, or at least that's one of the ideas of knight e6, and it also just shuts the diagonal. Anyway, h4, as played by Anand, is a very nice, useful move here. And after bishop to c8, another move that's, again, quite useful is h5. Now, black could put a queen on g5, but that doesn't do anything. White just retreats the queen, and then when he moves the knight away from e3, it'll evict it. Meanwhile, h5 prevents black from continuing with the kind of stock plan of g6, bishop g7, and so on. And so, again, black's kingside play is really severely constrained, while he has no targets on the queen side, and it's difficult for him to break in the center, too. So this is definitely becoming a very, very pleasant position for white. All right, c6, knight f5, threatening to take on h6, king h8, bishop e3, d5. So Aronian has made a little bit of progress here. He's closed the Spanish bishop's diagonal. He's grabbed some space in the center. But still, white is doing perfectly well. So he played queen to f3, putting some pressure on that pawn on d5, not letting Aronian just maintain that spot. And if the pawn pushes or captures on e4, then once again the bishop on a2 comes back to life. So Aronian tried knight to g5, and white traded. So the follow-up, well, he'd like to take on d5, but the knight hangs on f5, but now simply knight e3. So again, he's forcing this pawn to move, after which, again, the bishop on a2 becomes a very, very strong piece again. Well, Aronian decided that rather than allow this very bad positional state of affairs to arise, that he would go for a counterattack even at the cost of a pawn or so. So rook to e6, e takes d5, rook f6, queen e2, and now bishop to h3. So he's trying to throw the kitchen sink at Anand and hope that something will work out, but white defends very coolly. So he starts with d takes c6. And the point of this is not so much to be greedy, but to clear the d5 square for the bishop on a2 to go there to help cover g2. So rook to d8, and now, of course, that stops bishop to d5 because rook takes, knight takes, and then queen takes g2 is mate. So played b4, and that stops black from playing bishop to c5 to take on e3 and then take on g2. Or actually, bishop c5 and then bishop takes g2 would be the big threat because knight takes g2, rook f2. So b4 just cuts that out. All right, rook to d4, c3, rook d to f4. So he activates his rook, but now it allows bishop to d5 again. And Anand is perfectly happy to see rook takes f2. That'll just swap off. It will be an even trade. Queen and pawn for 2 rooks. White's already up 2 pawns anyway, so trading is fine. Black will be almost out of attacking force, and white would win very easily from there. So Aronian plays bishop to d6 instead, covering the c7 square to keep the pawn from running any further, and also hoping to get the bishop into play. All right, Anand plays f3, which is very useful, so that the pawn is protected. It's no longer hanging on f2. The g2 pawn is protected further, and white is ready to play bishop to e4, after which the whole black attack comes to a screeching halt. So Aronian throws a third pawn on the fire, and now plays rook h4. So here, Aronian has basically extracted the maximum that's possible from this position. I mean, all 5 of his pieces are hunting, over on white's king side. They're all either over there or pointing in that direction. But again, white has enough pieces to defend, and he's able to show that, in fact, everything is under control. So he starts with king to f1, threatening to just take on h3. And, well, I mean, that's a serious enough threat. Well, instead of retreating, Aronian decided to play for more tricks. So he plays bishop to f4, takes, and rook takes. Well, he is threatening mate in 2, rook h2 or rook h1 check, and then queen to g3 mate. But queen to g2 takes care of that. Rook to g3, and now queen f2. See, if he plays queen f2 immediately, then there's rook h1 check followed by rook to h2, winning white's queen. So even though white would actually have enough material even for there, there's no need. So queen g2, rook g3, queen f2. And now king to e2 really is a threat. All right, he tries rook to e6. And again, rather than dealing with any tricks like king e2, bishop takes e3, followed by f5 sooner or later, he just plays knight f5. So he prevents that, hits the rook on g3, and then finally after rook h3, queen g2, it was time for Aronian to throw in the towel. He's down a piece and 2 pawns, and he can't avoid the trade of queens, or maybe he can, but it would cost him something huge to do it. The reason being that something like queen takes h5 allows queen takes g7 mate. All right, so the bottom line then in all of this is that the anti-martial systems are still alive and well, and they're quite rich and quite playable. d4 is interesting, although I think black is probably doing okay there. a4 has certainly got a lot of life left in it, and of course, as I said, h3 is the main choice nowadays. But I don't know if it's objectively any better than a4. It just leads to different kinds of positions, and it does offer the option for black to transpose back to the main lines of the closed grouping. All right, so I hope you found this useful and interesting, whether you play the white side of this or the black side. Next time, I think we're going to look at the Martial Gambit, and we'll start with minor lines rather than the contemporary main lines with c6. Okay, so that's what's on the agenda for next time, I believe. And so we'll have that. We'll have, after that, the main lines of the Martial, contemporary Martial. And then after that, we'll have, I think, the Yates. Maybe a show on d3 lines, although I've talked about it so much in passing that it may not be necessary to do so, but we'll see. And then finally, we'll come to the main lines with h3, and then that'll do it. So we're not too far from the finish line here. All right, so again, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you next week. And again, I look forward to your comments and questions and feedback. So thanks. See you. Bye-bye.